Welcome to this fourth presentation on the narrative aesthetics, framing, and fiction. In the first lecture, the focus was on form, on the continuity of form. Then we had a lecture on glazes and the role of glazes in surfaces in ceramics. The previous lecture was on decoration and abstraction and ornament, and another aspect of surface where the surface is basically continuous and goes on forever within the concept of decoration. Today we will be looking at the narrative aesthetics, what happens when an image is inserted within an object, and we will look at this through framing and fiction. So what happens when 2D images and 3D form happen in the same object, when form and surface become one, when function and decoration are reunited, and when the image and the object become one unit. This is quite specific to ceramics in many ways, and for that reason very interesting to analyze and look into with some depth. So in the reading for this class, you will have a definition for image, a definition for object, and various analysis of what happens when they collide, when they come together on ceramics. So I will look here into the frame and framing devices, what happens when something is confined, has a clear border, is within limits, which is what a frame is. And we have here two wonderful examples from Greek time, with on the left the continuous 360-degree narrative that continues almost cinematically all around the vessel, and on the right the distortion of space by the parallax framing over convex form. So what happens when a square is inserted within a either convex or concave surface? It is distorted, and we call that the parallax distortion of space, and this is a great example of that on the right. Sometimes the silhouette of the vessel form is the frame itself, that the image is not contained specifically by a box, but extends all the way to the edge of the vessel, and it is the vessel itself that becomes the framing device. Something interesting to keep in mind, because it happens in various historical ceramic cultures, is the principle of elision. When something is missing, like for example the leg of the figure on the left disappear behind a rock that is not even there, it's not even represented, and on the right something is not represented, like the ground on which all of those figures are activated is not there at all. So that's called ellipsis. So there are all kinds of ways in which image and objects can come together in ceramic. This is an example by Akio Takamori, where the surface appears to be within the form, as if it penetrates the form, and it is in an interesting ambiguity of relation in terms of its position in space. We have another example of that here on those wonderful rockwood pottery vases from around 1900, where the image appears to penetrate the form as if it is in the middle of the object instead of on its surface. So another way to introduce this relationship between image and object, and form and surface, and 2D and 3D, is to describe the form by the surface, while the surface serves as elements to describe the form of the work itself. And you can also do the opposite of that. An example of that in Michael Lucero's large Dreamers, where the surface contests the form. The form is a head resting on its side, as if the figure was dreaming, and the representation of the surface is the dream of that figure, but they are in a contestation mode, one with the other. Diego Romero, in this work where there is a flat perception of a deep convex space, those are very deep half-spherical bowl, but when seen from a specific viewpoint they appear to have been flattened, and the image appears to be flat when it is actually quite distorted by the form. We have example of that in historical time with those wonderful minai ware from Iran from the 12th century. Again, we have a flat perception of a deep convex space, as you can see from the bowl itself, seen from the side on the right. So I will be showing you many examples of works, of very exciting works where image and object come together. Sometimes the form is quite classical and very simple, and it is the surface that activates it with images of contemporaneity and relevancy to the world in which we live now. References to tattoo, to graffiti are often found in those type of works. But it is also very interesting to look at a few historical examples where those effects happen, and I will not go very deeply into an analysis of those objects, but it is interesting on the one on the left where you see a painter painting a plate and the very same plate on which the image sits. So there is a relationship between the image and the object that's quite exciting here. I've talked a lot last week in the previous presentation on decoration about the blue willow pattern, which some of you may want to look into further and research further. This was again developed by Thomas Minton around 1780, and it came from English Delftware, it came from precedent in Chinese ceramics and so on, and as I mentioned the last time, it is used extensively by many artists to make all kinds of references in all kinds of ways, and I still have a few more examples. Some I showed you last time, like this iPod, but then displayed by Howard Cutler. It's a found object that's been modified with the addition of a decal of The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. And again, new examples I didn't show you last time, a digital paper plate and by Paul Scott, where he has altered the familiar image of the blue willow pattern by adding the Great Wave by Hokusai as an added element to reference the tsunami in Fukushima. And I have shown you Calamity Ware by Don Moyer last time as well. This is just a refresher to show you again how framing and framing devices and what happens when images and objects come together in exciting ways. And you have a great example of that here in this quite intense reworking of the blue willow pattern by a ceramic artist from South Africa who speaks about issues of social life in his country. Caroline Slutty, again, removing information by cutting and sandblasting aspects of the found objects to make you aware of what happens when you do such a dramatic thing. Deborah Sears with the stacking of a narrative, where the narrative is stacked up and goes from plate to plate as you assemble or disassemble the unit. And you have this quite amazing spilled narrative by Livia Marin, where the objects exits its content and spills it over the ground. I've talked about Brendan Tang before. This is an example of a work I've shown, but here where the image is contested by the orientation of the object, which is not logical. Where on the right, Kurt Weiser creates destabilization by putting the image over the form, which is in itself quite dramatic and dynamic. And you don't exactly know what you're looking at and where you are in relation with various images, and that's quite exciting too. So many artists use many strategies, using multiples, using digital printing, digital decal making, and assembling objects in very exciting ways, creating again large series of objects where the image transcends the edge of each one and distributes itself over a larger field in the fragmented framing device of Molly-Hatch. Or you can have groups of objects with a series of related images. So there is a grouping of different images, all related in some form or other, to create a stack of plates. I have shown you this wonderful work by Barbara Didock before. It is the reinterpretation of an image by successive painters. A wonderful work she made in Jindajan in China collaboratively with painters working throughout the city. And again, examples of that. So we've talked about blue and white. This is a bit of a revisit of the blue and white aesthetic within decoration, but here within the specific context of narrative images in the narrative aesthetics. Pretty soon, within the simulation aesthetic, we will look at the work of Bernard Palissy from 16th century France, but I wanted to show you two contemporary artists, Michel Erickson and Mara Superior, making references in their work of the narrative structures that Bernard Palissy used in the making of his beautiful oval dishes. So again, here examples of work by Raed Yassin incorporating contemporary events, materials from news sources, and so on to conflate together the familiarity of those forms and the innocence of the blue and white with subject matter of great confrontational value. And people do that all over the world in all kinds of ways, sort of reinterpreting the process of making pots, the conceptual nature of volume versus, convex space versus concave spaces, and references to popular culture in all kinds of ways. And of course, the wonderful work of Ai Weiwei here, speaking about boat people and people leaving war zones and introducing this material within the context of ceramics is a very exciting way to challenge our perception of those events within the context of a familiar form. So I have here sections on ceramics pictorial spaces specifically, and I want to address first the Asian pictorial space with the use of void and active presence within the work, because this is quite specific to Asian ceramics and quite exciting to consider for a variety of reasons. So you can see on the example on the left as well as on the right that the white empty background is actually part of the image and believably inserted within our experience of that image itself, and I call that active presence. And what happened when those objects were first seen in Europe and reinterpreted by various porcelain makers like Meissen, for example, they may have been copying Asian precedents, but they did not understand that very sophisticated relation of figure ground, of absence and emptiness as presence that we see so clearly in Asian ceramics. And what they did in copying those works is a very unconvincing ground, where emptiness is actually absence, which is the opposite of the effect achieved on the left. And interestingly enough, in the late 50s, early 60s, in propaganda ware made in China, we find again this weird Western pictorial void where the great sophistication of porcelain pictorial spaces we found in historical time all of a sudden is lost in those work. And we find again void as absence. So I have multiple examples of all kinds of ways images come in relation with an object, and this is active framing, where the image continues from the exterior to the interior of the form, and it creates a wonderful continuity within our experience of the object. And many contemporary artists work with similar ideas. Here in the case of Claire Vercoyen, active framing and exterior-interior continuity using translucency. The object is so very thin that the image inside is seen on the outside through the translucency of the material. You can have continuous exterior-interior through a gesture where a brushstroke starts on the outside of the objects and moves in a spiral into the interior and carry your eye and your whole body within the space of the interior of the bowl. And again here, the work of a Chinese artist with the wonderful Jindejian cityscape, where we have this wonderful relationship between the volume of the three-dimensional vessel, the flatness of the two-dimensional representation, and the use of empty ground as active presence, as I have mentioned just earlier. and an example here from an artist from Korea. So you can see that the sensibility is very different, but there is a real relationship between empty ground and representation that creates a continuity of great believability. While in the work of Félicité Elia from the United Kingdom, work that she has done collaboratively in China, that relationship is a little bit more awkward and less convincing. While on the left you have decoration as continuity, where the decoration goes all over and is quite credibly inserted within the form. On the right, the absence, void of the ground, this white empty space feels very distinct and separate from the image itself, and I again call that void as absence. I'm not saying here that one is better than the other. I'm just making a point that there is a very clear difference between an approach to empty space in Asian representation versus this approach to empty space in European or Western forms of representation, as we see here in the work of Robin Best from Australia, where the empty ground it reads as absence. An example again of the work of Ai Weiwei with the reversal of viewpoint I have mentioned in my previous lecture, a contestation of traditional form and traditional approach of that connection between image and objects that we find in historical time, and here presented in a very new and original and quite disruptive way. So it's interesting to consider that in ceramics we often have as well a multiplicity of decorative schemes and framing devices on a single object. This is something we're very familiar with in the world in which we live, where everything is collage and cut and paste together, and there are layers of information in just about everything we experience. But it finds its origin in ceramics in 16th century maiolica ware from Italy. We have weird examples of that as well later on in Sèvres porcelain, and this is references that Leopold L. Fulham uses in his work to great effect very often by making pictorial references to previous work, like this Meissen coffee pot finding itself on this assemblage of a teapot with a found metal mount. Leopold Fulham again making strategic references to specific historical precedents, like this wonderful ginger jar from Meissen. And all kinds of artists are using historical precedents and references to historical ceramics to make work of great contemporaneity that could have only been made in the very recent past, but creates a continuity of the connections with historical time that I find quite exciting. This is an example here, two examples in fact, of what I call the depth box, penetrating the form, where the image appears to be penetrating the space of the objects and be inserted inside it by the use of perspective or the strategic use of framing devices. And we have an example of that here in the work of Laurent Craste, where we have the depth box, where the image appears to be not on the surface of the objects, but within the form itself. Another very interesting phenomenon that's quite specific to ceramic objects is the continuous all-around uninterrupted surface, which creates a very interesting perceptual and psychological reversal, in which I go much deeper in the reading for this specific lecture, where I explain the working mechanism of this continuous uninterrupted surface on a ceramic vessel. And in my own work, I have used that principle by distorting the framing all over and all around the form, so that the image has been distorted with digital technology and recreated by being hand painted over the form, which distorts the image, although it develops itself all around the object as well. This is an example of relational framing, where the image goes from object to object, and some of those objects are 3D and some are 2D surfaces, and the mixing of all of those possibilities I call relational framing. And just a brief introduction of the work of Grayson Perry, of which I will speak much later. But again, a great example from Ashian here, where you have this extraordinary conflation between image and objects, 2D and 3D, decoration and representation in very exciting ways. So I have a large number of contemporary or quite recent examples of that. This is Pablo Picasso, where the flat surface is perceived as a volume. The image, which is quite graphic, becomes the representation of a large architectural space. And you have a contemporary maker working with those ideas as well in her work. Ken Price with Club Atomica and LA Landscape, working with all the possible complexities that happen when, again, those effects are achieved in ceramic objects. And the work of Leopold Fulham, again, where the surface becomes three-dimensional. The surface becomes the form, which is, again, something quite original in the development of a new possibilities in that relationship. Example by Marc Chagall. Many artists, painters worked in ceramics over the 20th century and before as well, and by inserting the sensibility and sophistication of their image making within the context of painting and translating it within the context of ceramics like Picasso did, great results are achieved as well. And we have an example of that in two works by Jasper Johns, which incorporate ceramics text, which we will see later on as well in one of the team, self-portraits, and all those things coming together to create a very interesting narrative in which ceramic plays a major role. And a small plaque, somewhat dish formed by Edouard Jasmin from Montreal, again combining many of those aspects in a much more naive and outsider art sensibility, but creating work of great efficiency. And many artists like Joan Todd from Toronto sometimes work in ceramics to embed within that specific context, which is a very domestic, sometimes perceived as feminine context, with images of contemporary strife. Richard Millet, who basically comes up in some form or other in most, if not all, of those lectures, here with the fragmentation of an image to negate the narrative. The representation on those reproduction of Idria vessels from antiquity are fragments of known paintings, and by presenting you just with a small fragment of it, he negates the importance of narration and storytelling for the interpretation of artworks. Another example of that here in this painting by Louis David on the right, and a representation of a tiny fragment of that painting in the work of Richard Millet. And in my own work, I have also disrupted images by putting half of the image on the exterior, half of it on the interior. From a specific viewpoint, they sort of reunify, but it still creates a very big disruption, where Wayne Igby on his wonderful landscape bowls create interior-exterior continuity. Or you can have exterior-interior contradiction, as we see in this bowl by Kitauji Rosanjin, the great Japanese potter, where on the exterior you have a scene of springtime and on the interior a scene of fall. So two different spaces, two different periods of the year, which creates a conflict and a contradiction between the two. And so many artists using representation on ceramics and all kinds of different ways of putting images on vessels. And I'm just introducing you to many of them. Some people working three-dimensionally, the 3D form itself as a narrative, and the relationship between all the elements creates some form of story you can engage with. In the work of Sun Kuyu, and of course the very extraordinary work of Michael Frimkes, who was the very first worldwide in the 1960s to recreate historical form in ceramics, but adding on those very familiar historical form. This is a ginger jar coming from the Asian repertoire of ceramic shapes, adding on those forms images of great contemporary sources speaking of social issues, racism, sexism, and all kinds of things. And the work of Michael Fremkes was tremendously influential because, as I mentioned, he was the first to do something so radical, so new, so different, reassessing the relationship of ceramics to historical precedents and how those things can still have relevancy today. And the work of Grayson Perry, for example, would be impossible to imagine without the example of Michael Fremkes, who led the way into making this type of work. And I will show quite a few examples of his work a bit later on, but many contemporary artists are followers of Michael Fremkes, possibly without even knowing that they are. Michael Fremkes is still alive and working in Los Angeles. And this is just to introduce you to the impact of his influence on the work of so many artists working in so many different ways in so many different countries for so many different reasons. And the wonderful work of Daniel Kruger here is exemplary in that sense. This is an example here of what I could call exploded framing, where the images framed within squares are basically exploded from the surface and are positioned on the exterior of it, which is quite interesting in itself. So I debate in the reading for this specific lecture that ceramic has more in common with photography than with sculpture. And I also analyze the difference between sculptural ceramic versus ceramic sculpture that you may want to consider for yourself. So ceramics and photography are related in so many exciting ways, and this is what I analyze in the text, and we'll go into a bit here in this presentation. But as you can see here in my own work, those Narcissus stack pieces presented on stainless steel discs that reflect the images positioned strategically on the forms. The images themselves are photographic images that have been digitally printed to be transferred ceramically onto those porcelain shapes. So there is a very deep relationship between photography and ceramics, I find, in all kinds of ways. This is what I call performative framing, where the framing creates a performance and the image going from frame to frame, again, informs a narrative that is reinforced by the other side of that objects, where you recreate the continuity of that image by rotating each vessel by 180 degrees to make the image within all those square frames logical again, so that the image is activated by your performance of the work, where you actually have to touch and handle the work to make it operate. And there is another example of interactive framing on the right, where by stacking or unstacking this pile of dishes, an event happened, and the same as well on the work on the left. Jenny Ma working with cinematic sequencing, where the image goes as a sequence of images that create almost a cinema effect on those vessels. And this is a detail of her work here. And this is quite an interesting approach, where the image develops not only in space but in time as well, the way cinema works. You can have 2D and 3D conflation, where the image is partly 2D, partly 3D, and it's in the dynamic relation between the two that the energy sits. So I'm just presenting to you various makers, various artists making images in all kinds of interesting ways over all kinds of interesting objects. You may want to research why Willie Tsang has put fingerprints on this cup and saucer, and when gesture and use imply a specific narrative in his work. Or issues of race and ethnicity, and what happens when those kinds of images are not only positioned strategically within the ceramic objects, but the fact that they are on the ceramic objects of whiteness, for example, and around issues of food, which we will look at later in another thematic lecture. And Suzanne Wolf with collage framing, where the images create a grouping of works that are in some form of relationship, but it's for you to decide what is the connection between those images and what kind of narrative you want to create with the relationship between those diverse things. Well, Marek Cecula, with reconstructed framing, with an image of the Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci being distributed over a series of 13 plates, and you can reconstruct the image by strategically repositioning the various aspects of the familiar and very famous image. Sometimes you have very stable framing, where the frame stabilizes the image, where other makers use unstable framing, where the position of the image within the context of the objects create a very unstable effect, which I find interesting in contrast with the other. And many examples of that exist in all kinds of various ways. Again, this is just to introduce you to great ceramic artists like Edward Eberle or Viola Frey, who have used images in very dynamic ways on their ceramic works. An example of that here in the work of James Lawton with his floating teapot. And you can have conflation of form and surface, where the form becomes the surface and the surface becomes the form, and where is the relationship between the two and which is which becomes confusing in the work of Michael Lucero. You can also address issues of directional viewpoint, where the image is meant to be seen from a specific position on the left, where on the right you have, by the same artist, Walter Ostrom, an image that can be seen from any direction, so it has a non-directional viewpoint. And those aspects of images on ceramic objects are quite specific to ceramics as an art form. People do a lot of social and political commentaries on ceramic objects as well right now, and that's an exciting use of narration and framing devices on ceramic itself. People use personal commemoratives as well, aspects of their own private personal life, like in the case of Andrew Rafferty here, or all kinds of popular culture references, propaganda ware, all kinds of issues, work made for all kinds of reasons, for all kinds of exciting contexts. And I've shown you the work of Charles Kraft before as well. This is somebody who works with all of those complex ideas in exciting ways. And the very extraordinary Mad Cow Bone China Meat Carving Dish by Paul Scott, which conflates the material, which is bone china, the subjects, which is cow being burnt, and the function of the objects, which is for meat carving. And I believe that only in ceramics would you have, in a single work of art, the conflation of so many various possibilities. Anna G., making references to memory of her childhood in New Jersey, or working at the Kohler factory in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, making portraits and narrative of all the workers in the factories. Anna G.'s work, again, memories of all the house in which she's lived, all the bed in which she slept. And recently she has made this wonderful refrigerator for Samsung, where an image of her work is inserted on a porcelain plaque within the interior of this domestic utensil. And we have Dolce & Gabbana, who have also designed a stove and a refrigerator in the blue and white style quite recently. The work of Matt Nolan from New York, incorporating with great richness and great complexity most of the ideas I've just explained to you in various ways, which is Jewish trophy or obese trophy, and Litter and Bigay and Handicapped Trophies made a whole series of those works in the 80s and 90s. Many of other makers combining all of those aspects of the 2D, 3D image objects, conflation that is possible within ceramics. I have a series of images here on the work of Katie King and her Vanity, where she has inserted text and images relating to being a young female artist in our day and age, and the relationship to relationship and to sexuality, and to various issues that are very pertinent in the contemporary world. And I believe ceramics is ideally positioned because of its amazing relationship to domesticity, to daily life, to the familiarity of those forms. We know what they are, we know what we can use them for, although it may be a fertility jar or a cellulite cream jar. And Mariko Peterson with the Carnivores of Canada, celebrating Canadianness and what it feels like and what it means to be a Canadian with her hockey vase. And then here I have quite a few images of Grayson Perry's work, because Grayson Perry is an immensely productive, inventive makers of wonderful surfaces and inserting images and representation within the context of ceramics through the use of all kinds of amazing processes. Here he integrates the viewer and the surroundings in the reflective surface of the vessel itself. That's an exciting way to engage the viewer within the work itself. He's a great master of material, of processes, of technique. He's a beautiful draftsman, and he can use all of those possibilities to make work which is at the level of form based on classical shapes, either from European antiquity or Asian vocabulary of shapes. And this is him here on the right, dressed as Claire, and with his wife and daughter. And I'm showing you a detail of his work here in this layered framing where images are on top of images, and it creates a very interesting positioning in space of where, in relation to the objects, those images sits and are meant to be experienced. And I'm showing you so many of them just to show you the inventiveness, his use of color, his use of relationships, between all of those disparate and quite conflicted elements at times. And you can see how the image develops on the exterior of the form in a three-dimensional way, 360 degrees, continuously all around the shape. So you either have to handle the objects or walk around it to get the cinematic effect that it implies. And yet two more of those extraordinary work using the extraordinary potential of ceramic forms, ceramic materials, ceramic processes, various decorative devices, and the completion of all kinds of framing devices and strategies to make work of amazing potency and power and great relevancy now. Younger artists are following in his footsteps in all kinds of exciting ways. Again, a reference to the Blue Willow pattern in the work of Philip Eglin, those large buckets over which, like the form is basically very ordinary, very banal, very dismissible. It's just a cylinder, quite a large one actually, almost half a meter tall, over which he has applied those very exciting images. While Kurt Weiser, using the all-over possibilities of images on ceramic forms and creating very psychological images around relationships and dream worlds and surrealist approach to image making, while Jason Walker will speak about ecological issues of the overuse of resources and pollution and so on in his work. Catherine Morling making narrative with the conflation and the coming together of all kinds of various 3D forms. Stephen Bird, whose work again we've looked at before, we'll look at again. Really addressing what is ceramic, what is it about, what can it do, why does it do those things, what happens when those things are done within that context. And an example of that in the work of Paul Masak, the wonderful work of Richard Nutkin here with a detail of his smoked work, incorporating all kinds of images, fragments of images, bits and pieces of skeletons and skulls and all kinds of other references to human bodies and so on to create a nuclear cloud. Many illustrators who are known for their practice in illustrations are also using ceramics in its possibility to shift viewpoint. When you look at the work on the right from a certain direction, it will look like the work on the left. And so it's quite interesting to consider ceramics in its relation to illustration, and those are a few very important makers that I wanted you to be aware of, because it's something exciting happens with the permanency of the material, the permanency of the image, and how a amphora form made at a very, very large scale, this is way bigger than a human being, and then covered with images of bodies in various relationships, with the tremendously dynamic use of colors and images in the work of Viola Fry, again here in the work of Amanda Church, working on the very familiar format of bathroom tiles, Paul Macmillan, another ceramic maker, working with all of those issues in his work, and the wonderful work of Patti Warashina made in the 1970s, where you have again the 2D, 3D continuity. Some of aspects of those sculptural works are three-dimensional, some other aspects are two-dimensional, and they go from one to the other seamlessly in ways that are quite exciting. I also really like those work by Patti Warashina from the early 1970s, where there is an absolute surface-form conflation. The surface is given by the form gives the surface, and both are intimately connected in ways that are quite specific to ceramics again. And while other people like Janet Debus make works with pots on pots on pots, which is an exciting way to connect image and object, 2D and 3D in ceramics. And just to remind you that it is always important to consider to do with ceramics what can only be done in ceramics. And ceramics is an archive, so one has to decide what to archive and how to archive. And I hope I have presented to you today quite a few very exciting possibilities for this to happen within the context of the narrative aesthetics, where what is important is not the story. What is important is how the story is told. Thank you, and see you next week.